On September 19, 1944, a German Panther tank commander peered through the dense morning fog blanketing the fields of eastern France. He commanded one of the most feared weapons in the German arsenal. The Panther carried frontal armor 80 millimeters thick, sloped at 55 degrees to maximize its protective value. Its high-velocity 75mm K, WK, 42 gun could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. The weapon was so accurate that trained crews could hit targets at distances where American tankers could barely see their opponents. Behind him rolled dozens more Panthers, part of a force of over 260 tanks and assault guns assembled for a single purpose: crush the Americans and halt Patton's drive toward the German homeland. 700 yards away, hidden behind a low ridge near the village of Bézange-la-Petite, Captain Kenneth Lamison of the 37th Tank Battalion waited with 4 Sherman tanks. His Shermans carried 75mm guns that could barely scratch the Panther's frontal armor at any range. The Sherman's own armor was thinner, its profile taller, and its silhouette easier to spot against the horizon. Military experts on both sides had calculated that it took 5 Shermans to destroy 1 Panther. Some estimates were even more pessimistic. The German tankers advancing through the fog knew these numbers. They had been told repeatedly of their technical superiority. They expected the Americans to break and run the moment superior German armor appeared from the mist. Captain Lamison had other plans. In the next 3 minutes, his 4 tanks would destroy 8 Panthers without taking a single hit. The German crews never fired a shot. The Battle of Arracourt was about to shatter every assumption the German High Command held about American fighting capability. Over 11 days of brutal armored combat in the rolling farmland of Lorraine, outnumbered American tank crews would destroy approximately 200 German armored vehicles while losing fewer than 50 of their own. The kill ratio would approach 5-1. The vaunted panzer formations that Hitler had assembled to crush the American advance would be annihilated. The Germans arrived expecting easy victory against soft Americans in inferior tanks. They discovered something very different. The misjudgment that led German armor into the killing fields of Lorraine began months earlier, in the desperate summer of 1944. The Allied invasion at Normandy on June 6th had established a beachhead that grew stronger every day despite fierce German resistance. For weeks the front lines barely moved as both sides fed reinforcements into the grinding attrition of the hedgerow country. Then on July 25th, Operation Cobra shattered the German left flank. American forces poured through the breach. What followed was one of the most dramatic collapses in military history. German forces in France disintegrated with stunning speed. Army Group B lost over 400,000 men in the Falaise pocket alone, trapped between converging Allied armies and hammered from the air by fighter bombers that turned every road into a charnel house of burning vehicles and dead men. Entire divisions ceased to exist as organized fighting forces. The Wehrmacht, that had conquered Europe from the English Channel to the gates of Moscow, was bleeding to death in the hedgerows and sunken lanes of France. Adolf Hitler responded to catastrophe with characteristic delusion. Rather than consolidate his remaining forces behind defensible lines, rather than accept that his armies needed time to rebuild before resuming offensive operations, he ordered the creation of 10 new panzer brigades in early September. These were numbered 101 through 110. A second wave followed almost immediately, numbered 111 through 113. These formations would counterattack the advancing Americans, restore the front, and protect the vital industrial regions of Western Germany. On paper, each brigade possessed approximately 90 tanks, roughly half Panthers and half Panzer IVs, plus supporting assault guns, infantry, and artillery. The numbers looked formidable. The reality was far different. Inspector General of Panzer Troops Horst Stumpf later provided a damning assessment of these hastily assembled units. The brigades had never been able to hold combined exercises. Junior officers had no idea of the commitment of motorized formations. The 113th Panzer Brigade, which would bear the brunt of fighting at Arracourt, had formed on September 4, 1944. It entered combat on September 19, 15 days from creation to battle. Some tank crews had assembled just 48 hours before they rolled toward American positions. They had never trained together, never maneuvered as a unit, and never practiced the coordination between tanks that meant survival in combat. The problems extended far beyond crew inexperience. The brigades lacked organic reconnaissance units, the eyes and ears that armored formations needed to locate enemy positions and avoid ambushes. They were forced to advance blindly against American defenses, whose locations they could only guess. Tank radios were incompatible with brigade headquarters, requiring armor battalions to attach themselves to infantry units simply to communicate with their own commanders. The technical standardization that should have been fundamental to military operations had broken down entirely. Perhaps most critically, the brigade commanders were veterans of the Eastern Front who assumed American forces would behave like Soviet infantry. They expected the Americans to stay in place when surprised, to panic when confronted by massed armor, to collapse and run rather than fight. They did not bother to reconnoiter American positions because they believed reconnaissance was unnecessary against such a weak opponent. They forgot all lessons about combined arms and relied completely on their superior tanks. This assumption would prove fatal. This arrogance had deep roots in German military culture. A profound contempt for American fighting ability had developed among Wehrmacht officers since the United States entered the war. The disaster at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, where Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Arracourt had torn through inexperienced American units in Tunisia, reinforced existing prejudices. German officers who had spent years fighting on the Eastern Front believed that nothing in the West could match the ferocity and scale of combat against the Soviets. The Russians had thrown millions of men against German positions. The Russians had fought with a savage determination, born of defending their homeland against an invader committed to their extermination. What could the soft, consumer-oriented Americans possibly offer compared to that? German intelligence reports emphasized American material abundance while dismissing American fighting spirit. The Americans had more trucks, more aircraft, and more artillery shells, more of everything that could be counted and measured. But they lacked the warrior tradition that supposedly made German soldiers superior. They relied on machines rather than courage. They called in airstrikes rather than closing with the bayonet. Surely German technical superiority in tank design, combined with superior German combat experience, would overcome any numerical disadvantage the Americans might enjoy. General Hasso von Manteuffel, who took command of 5th Panzer Army on September 1st, 1944, understood the strategic necessity of the counter-offensive, even if he harbored private doubts about how it would be executed. Just 46 years old and standing only 5 feet 2 inches tall, Manteuffel was one of the ablest German commanders of the war. A small man who compensated for his stature with boundless energy and aggressive tactical instincts. He had commanded armoured divisions on the Eastern Front with distinction. Now he faced a very different enemy with forces assembled in haste and committed to battle before they were ready. The strategic situation demanded action, General George Patton's Third Army had raced 400 miles from Normandy to the Moselle River in barely 6 weeks, one of the most rapid advances in military history. The American spearheads had driven a dangerous wedge between two German armies, threatening to split the entire German position in France. Worse still, the West Wall, the fortified Siegfried Line, that was supposed to protect the German homeland from invasion, remained largely unmanned after 4 years of neglect. The bunkers and pillboxes had been constructed in the late 1930s, then stripped of their weapons and garrisons when those resources were needed elsewhere. If Patton broke through before the defences could be manned, no effective barrier existed between Lorraine and the Rhine River. The industrial heartland of the Saar lay exposed. What the Germans did not fully understand was why Patton had stopped. His Third Army had not halted because of German resistance. It had halted because it ran out of fuel. On August 31, 1944, fuel allocations to Third Army dropped dramatically, roughly 1/18 of what Patton had requested and 1/18 of what he needed to maintain his advance. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower had prioritized Operation Market Garden. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's ambitious airborne assault aimed at capturing bridges across the Lower Rhine in the Netherlands. Supplies that should have fueled Patton's tanks flowed north instead. Patton raged against the decision. He believed, probably correctly, that his forces could reach the Rhine and possibly cross it before the Germans could establish a coherent defence. He argued that his offensive should receive priority over Montgomery's operation, which he dismissed as a strategic sideshow. But Eisenhower had made his choice, and Patton, despite his famous insubordination in other matters, obeyed the order. Third Army stopped. To German intelligence officers watching from across the lines, the American pause looked like exhaustion or weakness. They saw an overextended army at the end of a 400-mile supply line. They saw units that had outrun their logistics. They saw an opportunity to strike before the Americans could consolidate their gains and resume their advance. What they could not see was that the apparent weakness was temporary, that supplies would resume flowing once Eisenhower adjusted his priorities, and that the tankers of the 4th Armoured Division were anything but soft. The 4th Armoured Division that awaited the German onslaught in September 1944 had been forged into one of the finest armoured formations in any army through months of intensive training and 3 months of continuous combat since landing in France. Its commander, Major General John Shirley Wood, was a tactical innovator who emphasized speed, flexibility, and aggressive action above all else. British military historian Basil Liddell Hart would later call him the Rommel of the American armoured forces, a comparison that captured both his tactical brilliance and his willingness to take calculated risks. Wood had trained his division relentlessly in the deserts of California and the fields of England before the invasion. His tankers had learned to think for themselves, to exploit opportunities without waiting for orders from higher headquarters, to keep moving and keep fighting regardless of what happened around them. Combat Command A, which would bear the primary burden at Arracourt, was led by Colonel Bruce Clark, a West Point graduate who combined tactical brilliance with an unshakable calm under fire that steadied everyone around him. Clark had studied German armoured tactics carefully. He understood that the enemy would likely attack with superior numbers and better equipment. His response was to choose ground that negated those advantages and to prepare his positions with meticulous attention to fields of fire, concealment, and routes of withdrawal. Clark organized his command for the mobile defense that the situation demanded. He positioned his units on the ridgelines and hills that dominated the Lorraine countryside, terrain features that his tankers had studied until they knew every fold in the ground. He established observation posts connected by telephone wire to concealed tank positions, allowing forward observers to direct fire onto approaching enemy forces without revealing the location of the shooters. He prepared alternate positions so that tanks could displace after firing, avoiding the counterfire that would follow any engagement. The heart of Combat Command A's striking power was the 37th Tank Battalion, commanded by 30-year-old Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Williams Abrams. Abrams was already becoming a legend among American tankers. He led from the front, commanding his tank Thunderbolt from the turret rather than from a safe headquarters miles behind the lines. He believed that a commander needed to see the battlefield with his own eyes, to understand the situation as his soldiers experienced it, to share their dangers and earn their trust through presence rather than exhortation. He would wear out 6 tanks bearing the name Thunderbolt during the war, though he never had one shot out from under him. His aggressive instincts and tactical acumen had earned him a reputation as one of the finest tank commanders in the entire United States Army. General Patton himself, no slouch when it came to armored warfare, would later say that he was supposed to be the best tank commander in the Army, but he had one peer, Abe Abrams. He called him the world champion. Coming from Patton, the remark constituted the highest possible praise. The 37th Tank Battalion fielded approximately 53 M4 Sherman tanks at the start of the battle, primarily the M4A3 variant with the standard 75mm gun. The Sherman was not a tank designed to fight other tanks. It had been conceived as an infantry support weapon, reliable and mechanically simple enough to be produced in vast numbers by American factories and maintained by crews who might have been automobile mechanics 6 months earlier. Its armor was thinner than the Panthers. Its gun was less powerful. In a straight fight at long range, where the Panther's superior optics and more powerful cannon could be brought to bear, the American tank had no chance. But American tankers had learned that war is never a straight fight. They had developed tactics through hard experience that exploited the Sherman's strengths while minimizing its weaknesses. The Sherman's turret traversed faster than the Panther's, powered by an electro-hydraulic system that could spin the gun onto a new target in seconds regardless of engine speed. The Panther relied on an engine-driven hydraulic system where traverse speed depended on engine revolutions per minute. In close combat, where targets appeared suddenly from behind ridgelines or around the corners of buildings, where reaction time meant the difference between survival and a burning death, this advantage in turret speed could prove decisive. American crews had also learned to use terrain with deadly effectiveness. They selected hull-down positions on reverse slopes, driving forward until only their turrets showed above the crest of a hill, exposing the minimum possible target to enemy fire while keeping the vulnerable hull protected by solid earth. They established ambush positions in barns, in tree lines, in farmyards, anywhere that concealment could be found. They laid telephone wire from observation posts back to hidden tanks, allowing forward observers to report enemy movements and call fire onto approaching vehicles without revealing the location of the shooters. When German tanks advanced into these prepared killing grounds without reconnaissance, without any awareness of where the American positions lay, they died. Supporting the Sherman crews was the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with 36 M18 Hellcat tank destroyers. The Hellcat was a remarkable weapon that embodied American tank destroyer doctrine in its purest form. It mounted the same 76mm gun fitted to upgunned Shermans on an open-top chassis that weighed barely half as much as the Sherman and could reach speeds of 55 miles per hour on roads. It was the fastest armored vehicle in any army. Its thin armor, less than an inch at maximum, made it vulnerable to any hit, but its blistering speed allowed it to strike from unexpected directions and vanish before the enemy could respond. The tank destroyer doctrine emphasized mobility over protection, the ability to choose the time and place of engagement rather than absorbing punishment. At Arracourt, that doctrine would prove devastatingly effective. The Germans attacked on September 18, 1944, advancing toward the town of Lunéville against American screening forces. Heavy morning fog blanketed the countryside, reducing visibility to less than 100 yards in many areas. This fog would become a defining feature of the battle. For nearly 2 weeks, dense mist rolled across the Lorraine plains each morning as moisture rose from the rivers and streams that cut through the farmland. The fog typically burned off only in the late afternoon as the sun finally gathered enough strength to clear the air. This meant that most combat occurred in conditions of severely limited visibility, fundamentally changing the nature of armored warfare. The fog neutralized the Panthers' greatest advantage. The German tank's superb 75mm gun and excellent optics had been designed for engagements at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. At such distances, the Panther could destroy American tanks with impunity, hitting targets that could barely see the threat, much less engage it effectively. But in the murk of a Lorraine morning, with visibility measured in tens of yards rather than thousands of meters, combat occurred at ranges of a few hundred yards or less. At those distances, Sherman crews could penetrate Panther side armor with their 75mm guns. At those distances, the faster traverse of American turrets became a matter of life and death. The fighting on September 18 was a prelude to the main event. American forces destroyed 24 German armored vehicles, while the attackers bypassed Lunéville and pushed toward Arracourt. The main tank battle began the following morning. September 19, 1944, dawned with fog so thick that tankers could hardly see beyond 75 yards. The Lorraine countryside had vanished into a grey blanket that muffled sound and erased horizons. At approximately 0700 hours, Panthers from the 113th Panzer Brigade emerged from the mist near the village of Lizy. They were advancing blind, without reconnaissance, without any idea where American tanks might be waiting. 3 Panthers were destroyed instantly at point-blank range by American tanks that had been invisible seconds before, positioned in hull down positions that the German crews never saw until the muzzle flashes lit the fog. Throughout the morning, the pattern repeated with deadly monotony. German tanks rolled forward into the fog, following roads and farm tracks that led toward American positions. American tankers, positioned on ridgelines and behind terrain features they had carefully studied during days of preparation, waited patiently in concealment until the enemy closed to effective range. Then they opened fire. Staff Sergeant Timothy Dunn engaged a Panther at 600 meters, destroying it with rounds from his 76mm gun. Other crews scored kills at ranges so close that the muzzle blast of their guns singed the paint on enemy hulls. The most remarkable action of the day belonged to Captain Kenneth Lamison of Company C, receiving reports of German armor moving toward Bézange-la-Petite. Lamison made a decision that would become legendary in armored warfare. He raced his 4 Shermans 3,000 yards across country, pushing his tanks at maximum speed over unfamiliar ground to reach a ridge overlooking the German approach route. They arrived 3 minutes before 8 Panthers appeared from the fog. Those 3 minutes made all the difference. Lamison positioned his tanks in hull, down positions along the ridge crest, their guns trained on the road below. When the Panthers emerged from the fog, still in road column, unaware that American tanks waited above them, Lamison's crews opened fire simultaneously. Using the Sherman's faster turret traverse, they destroyed 4 Panthers before a single German tank could bring its gun to bear. The Panther crews were still traversing their turrets, still trying to identify the source of the fire that was killing them, when their tanks exploded. The surviving Panthers tried to deploy into fighting formation, but Lamasson had already ordered his tanks to back over the ridge crest, using the reverse slope for cover. The American tanks repositioned rapidly along the ridge, appearing at a different point from where they had originally fired. The German tankers, disoriented and frightened, fired at positions their enemies had already abandoned. Lamesson's crews emerged at their new positions and destroyed the remaining 4 Panthers. 8 enemy tanks killed. 4 American tanks engaged. 0 American losses. The entire engagement lasted less than 3 minutes. First Lieutenant Edwin Leiper of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion experienced combat even more intimately that day, establishing a blocking position on Hill 246 with his platoon of M18 Hellcats. Leiper was startled to see the muzzle of a German tank gun sticking out through the trees at what seemed to be less than 30 feet away. The fog had brought the two forces into contact at a range where tank warfare became almost personal. Leiper's platoon engaged in a swirling fight among the ridges and woodlines around Hill 246. The Hellcats used their tremendous speed to dart between positions, firing and moving before the Germans could respond. Their 76mm guns punched through Panther side armor at ranges where the American crews could practically hear the German crews shouting to each other. By the end of the day, Leiper's platoon had destroyed 14 Panzers while losing only 3 of their own vehicles. By nightfall on September 19, the 113th Panzer Brigade had lost 43 tanks, most of them Panthers, the very weapon that was supposed to guarantee German victory. Approximately 200 German infantry lay dead on the battlefield. Combat Command. A reported losses of 5 Shermans and 3 Hellcats. The first day's fighting had produced a kill ratio exceeding 5-1. The Panthers' supposed invincibility had been thoroughly disproven. The German commanders refused to accept what had happened. They attributed their losses to temporary misfortune, to the fog that had robbed them of their technological advantage, to bad luck rather than enemy skill. Surely when the weather cleared, when their superior tanks could engage at proper ranges, when the mist no longer concealed American positions, the outcome would be different. They reorganized their battered formations, brought up reinforcements from the 111th and 112th Panzer Brigades, and prepared to attack again. September 20th brought more fog and more disaster for the Germans. Panthers advanced toward Combat Command A's headquarters, penetrating deeper than any previous attack. The situation briefly became critical as German tanks approached the command post where Colonel Clark directed the battle. American artillerymen of the 66th Armored Field Artillery Battalion responded by manning their M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers for direct fire, engaging German tanks at ranges of 200 yards with 105mm shells. The Priest were not designed for tank combat. Their thin armor offered no protection against return fire, but their heavy guns could destroy any armored vehicle at point-blank range. The artillerymen fought as tank crews, buying time for the Shermans to reposition. That afternoon, one of the war's more unusual tank killers entered the battle. Major Charles Carpenter, nicknamed Bazooka Charlie by his fellow soldiers, was an artillery observation pilot who flew tiny L-4 Grasshopper aircraft over the battlefield to direct artillery fire onto enemy positions. Carpenter had grown frustrated with merely observing the enemy and had personally modified his aircraft to carry 6 bazooka rocket launchers, 3 under each wing. He called his plane Rosie the Rocketer. Flying low over the battlefield, through air filled with tracer fire and exploding shells, Carpenter made attack runs against German armor massed below. He fired rockets at tanks that could not elevate their guns high enough to engage his slow-moving aircraft. He destroyed several armored vehicles during the Arracourt fighting and would ultimately be credited with 6 tank kills by war's end. The surviving German tanks, unable to fight back against a threat they had never trained to counter, retreated in confusion. September 21st brought the first clear skies since the battle began. For the Germans, this should have been the moment when their superior range and accuracy finally asserted themselves. Their Panthers could now engage American tanks at the long ranges for which they had been designed. The technological advantage that fog had negated would now prove decisive. Instead, clear skies brought a massacre from the air. P-47. Thunderbolts of the 405th Fighter Group descended on German armour columns with 500-pound bombs, high-velocity aircraft rockets, and 850 caliber machine guns firing in concentrated bursts that could shred the thin top armour of any tank. The fighter bombers hunted German vehicles wherever they found them, catching tanks in the open, on roads, in assembly areas. Crews who had survived the fog-bound fighting of previous days died under clear blue skies. When the 37th Tank Battalion assembled near Lizy that evening, dozens of blackened German tanks lay smoking across the battlefield, within view of the assembly area alone. The burned-out hulks stretched across the fields and along the roads, monuments to German miscalculation. Colonel Heinrich Walter Bronsart von Schellendorf, commander of the 111th Panzer Brigade, was killed on September 22nd. Colonel Erich Freiherr von Seckendorf, commander of the 113th Panzer Brigade, was killed on September 23rd near Lagarde. 2 of the 3 Panzer Brigade commanders committed to the battle were dead within days of initial contact with American forces. The leadership that might have adapted German tactics to the unexpected American resistance was being systematically destroyed. The fighting on September 22nd centered on the village of Uvalise, where the 11th Panzer Division, a veteran formation far more capable than the hastily assembled brigades, launched the heaviest German attack of the battle. The 11th Panzer had fought on the Eastern Front for years. Its crews were experienced professionals who had survived combat against Soviet armour. This was not a formation assembled in 2 weeks. This was a unit that knew how to fight. The Germans attacked in thick pre-dawn fog, achieving surprise for the first time in the battle. Infantry and armour advanced together in coordinated assault, the combined arms tactics that the Panzer brigades had forgotten. By noon, German forces had captured Uvalise and were pushing beyond it toward American rear areas. For a few hours it appeared that experienced leadership might turn the tide. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams organized the counterattack personally, leading the 37th Tank Battalion forward alongside infantry from the 10th Armoured Infantry Battalion. He did not direct the operation from a headquarters miles behind the lines. He commanded from the turret of Thunderbolt, visible to his tankers, sharing their risks. Company A of the 37th Tank Battalion, with just 7 operational tanks, engaged 22 German armoured vehicles on the high ground west of Uvalise. The American tankers fired from positions they had studied during days of defensive preparation, using terrain features they had memorized to mask their movements and protect their flanks. They fired at ranges of 400 to 2,000 yards, choosing their moments carefully, displacing between shots to avoid return fire. 17 German tanks were destroyed on the slopes of that hill. Only 5 escaped. By nightfall on September 22nd, the 111th Panzer Brigade had been reduced to 7 operational tanks and approximately 80 men. A formation that had deployed with 90 tanks and thousands of soldiers had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force in 4 days of combat. It would never be reconstituted. The organizational contrast between the two armies became starkly apparent as the battle progressed. American units maintained cohesion even when taking losses. Crews from disabled tanks were quickly reassigned to replacement vehicles that arrived from maintenance units in the rear. Mechanics worked around the clock to return damaged Shermans to service, cannibalizing parts from wrecks to keep operational tanks running. The supply chain that had starved Third Army of fuel still delivered ammunition and spare parts in adequate quantities to sustain combat operations. German logistics were collapsing. The Panzer brigades had deployed with minimal support infrastructure because there had been no time to organize proper supply arrangements. Damaged tanks could not be recovered because the heavy bridging equipment and tank transporters needed to move them had never arrived with the formation. Spare parts were unavailable because the supply system could not keep pace with the desperate pace of commitment to battle. Fuel was critically short throughout 5th Panzer Army. Tanks that broke down on the march were abandoned where they stopped, left for American intelligence officers to examine and American salvage crews to recover. The technological superiority of German armor meant nothing when the tanks could not move or shoot. The institutional differences between the armies ran far deeper than logistics. American tank crews had trained together for months, sometimes years before seeing combat. They knew their vehicles intimately. They trusted the men in neighboring tanks to support them when combat began. When a platoon leader was killed, his successor stepped into the role seamlessly because doctrine and procedures were standardized throughout the army. German crews, hastily assembled from replacement depots and training schools across the Reich, often met their fellow tankers for the first time on the road to battle. Tank commanders did not know the capabilities of their crews. Crews did not know the tactical methods their commanders preferred. Loaders who had trained on Panzer IVs found themselves assigned to Panthers they had never seen before. Gunners who had qualified on ranges in Germany discovered that combat in France bore no resemblance to firing at stationary targets. The American institutional commitment to learning from combat experience also proved decisive. After every engagement, surviving crews debriefed their actions. What worked? What failed? What could be done differently next time? What did the enemy do that surprised them? And how should they respond? These lessons were compiled, analyzed, and distributed throughout the formation. Tactics evolved in real time as experience accumulated. German doctrine remained rigid. Commanders who had fought on the Eastern Front applied lessons learned against Soviet forces that did not translate to combat against Americans. They expected American units to stay in place and die when surrounded. Instead, American tankers maneuvered aggressively, struck from unexpected directions, and withdrew before the Germans could mass superior force against them. The tactical flexibility that Wood and Clark had trained into the 4th Armoured Division constantly surprised opponents who expected a more predictable enemy. The fighting continued through the final week of September, shifting to the area around Chateau Salins and a series of hills that dominated the surrounding countryside. The 112th Panzer Brigade, which had been held in reserve while the other brigades were destroyed, now entered the battle. Fresh German tanks pushed forward against American positions that had been reinforced and improved during a week of continuous combat. First Lieutenant James Fields of the 10th Armoured Infantry Battalion earned the Medal of Honor, the first awarded in Patton's Third Army, for his actions at Arracourt on September 27th. Defending a critical roadblock with his infantry platoon, Fields was severely wounded in the face and head by shell fragments from a German tank round that exploded nearby. The wounds left him temporarily unable to speak, blood streaming down his face, his vision partially obscured. Despite his injuries, Fields refused evacuation and led his platoon in a counterattack that stopped a German armoured thrust. Using a Browning automatic rifle he had picked up from a fallen soldier, he personally silenced 2 enemy machine gun positions that were pinning down his men. He continued to direct his platoon's defense until the German attack was broken. Only 11 of his 55 men survived the engagement. September 29th marked the final German effort. Fog again covered their assembly areas as they prepared one last, coordinated assault with whatever armor remained operational. German commanders hoped that the fog would again provide concealment for their approach, that one more attack might achieve what all the previous attacks had failed to accomplish. When the fog lifted that morning, an American tank commander occupying a hilltop observation post looked down into the valley below. The sight that greeted him would have seemed impossible a month earlier. German tanks were massed in the open, dozens of armoured vehicles waiting in close formation for the order to advance. They had assembled under cover of fog and now sat exposed as the morning sun burned away their concealment. He called in their location. P-47 fighter bombers arrived within minutes. The slaughter that followed effectively ended the Battle of Arracourt. German tanks that had survived 11 days of ground combat died in minutes under aerial attack. Crews abandoned vehicles and fled on foot. Armoured formations dissolved into mobs of frightened men seeking cover from the fighters that circled overhead. The final 4 days of fighting cost Germany 36 additional tanks, confirmed destroyed, over 700 killed and 300 wounded. 5th Panzer Army, which had deployed for the offensive with 262 tanks and assault guns, was reduced to 25 operational armoured vehicles. The counter-offensive was suspended. There was nothing left to attack with. The panzer brigades that Hitler had conjured into existence to stop Patton had ceased to exist as fighting formations. The 111th Panzer Brigade was gone. The 113th Panzer Brigade was gone. The 112th Panzer Brigade had been gutted. The veteran 11th Panzer Division had suffered crippling losses. 2 brigade commanders were dead. Countless company commanders and platoon leaders had been killed leading attacks into American ambushes. The statistics of the battle told a story of comprehensive German failure. Of the 262 German tanks and assault guns committed to the offensive, 86 were confirmed destroyed by American ground forces. 114 were damaged or broken down and subsequently abandoned. Only 62 remained operational when the offensive ended. P-47 fighter bombers alone accounted for 73 confirmed tank kills. American losses in the 4th Armoured Division during September 1944 amounted to 41 Sherman tanks destroyed and 7 light tanks lost. Total casualties were 225 killed and 648 wounded. Combat Command. A specifically lost approximately 32 armoured vehicles while destroying nearly 200 enemy tanks and assault guns. The kill ratio of approximately 5-1 made Arracourt one of the most lopsided American armoured victories of the war. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion's performance deserved special recognition. Its M18 Hellcats destroyed dozens of German tanks, while suffering minimal losses. The doctrine of speed and mobility over armour protection, which many had questioned before the war, had proven devastatingly effective in the hands of well-trained crews, who understood how to exploit their vehicles' advantages. Hitler, characteristically, was unsatisfied. He relieved Army Group G, Commander General Johannes Blaskowitz on September 21st, in the midst of the battle, seeking a scapegoat for the failure of his hastily conceived offensive. The dysfunction at the highest levels of German command ensured that the lessons of Arracourt would not be learned in time to prevent similar disasters in the months ahead. The men who had fought and won at Arracourt returned to the rhythms of war that would continue for another 8 months. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams led the 37th Tank Battalion in the relief of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge 3 months later, where his aggressive thrust broke through German lines surrounding the 101st Airborne Division. His tank Thunderbolt was the first American vehicle to enter the beleaguered town. He finished the war as one of the most decorated officers in the United States Army. Abrams remained in uniform after the war ended, rising steadily through the ranks as the Army transitioned from the mass mobilization force of World War II to the professional military of the Cold War. He commanded forces in Vietnam during the most difficult years of that conflict and eventually served as Army Chief of Staff. When the United States developed a new main battle tank in the 1970s to replace the aging M60 series, the Army named it the M1 Abrams in his honor. His widow christened the first production tank. The vehicle that bears his name remains the backbone of American armored forces today, a fitting tribute to the young lieutenant colonel who proved at Arracourt that the measure of armor is not the thickness of its steel, but the quality of the men inside it. Colonel Bruce Clark, who orchestrated Combat Command A's defensive masterpiece, continued to serve with distinction throughout the remainder of the war and beyond. He would later describe Arracourt as his greatest victory, the engagement where everything he had learned about armored warfare came together in perfect execution. He eventually retired as a 4-star general after a career that included command responsibilities in Korea and Europe. His tactics at Arracourt became required study at the Army's Armor School, where generations of officers learned how a well-led force could defeat a numerically and technologically superior enemy through superior training, terrain exploitation, and tactical flexibility. The 4th Armored Division continued fighting across France and into Germany, compiling a combat record that led it to become the first American armored division to receive the Presidential Unit Citation. The division also earned the French Croix de Guerre with Palm for its actions along the Moselle River during September 1944. Its reputation as one of the finest armored formations of the war was cemented in the fog-shrouded fields around Arracourt. The German Panzer brigades that had been destroyed in Lorraine were never reconstituted. The surviving personnel were folded into other formations or fed into the defensive battles on both eastern and western fronts. The institutional experiment of creating instant armored divisions through crash training programs was quietly abandoned. Building effective tank formations required time, training, and experienced leadership. Germany had run out of all three. The lessons of Arracourt transcend the specific circumstances of September 1944. The battle demonstrated that technological superiority alone does not guarantee victory. The Panther tank was objectively a better vehicle than the Sherman in most measurable specifications. It had thicker armor, a more powerful gun, better optics, superior range. In a laboratory comparison measuring armor thickness and muzzle velocity and penetration at various ranges, the Panther won every category that mattered. But war is not conducted in laboratories. The Panther's advantages meant nothing when fog reduced engagement ranges to a few hundred yards. Its superior armor could not protect crews who advanced blindly into prepared ambushes. Its powerful gun could not hit targets that American tankers concealed behind ridge crests and inside buildings. Technology is only as effective as the doctrine, training, and leadership that employ it. The human element remained decisive. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams leading from his tank turret, Captain Lamison racing his 4 Shermans to reach a critical ridge 3 minutes before the enemy. Staff Sergeant Dunn calmly engaging Panthers at 600 meters. First Lieutenant Leiper fighting at ranges so close he could see the enemy gun muzzle through the trees. These men and thousands like them determined the outcome of battle through skill, courage, and initiative that no amount of superior equipment could overcome. The Germans had measured American capability by performance in peacetime and in early, tentative engagements. They saw the Sherman's inferior specifications and concluded that American armor was weak. They remembered Kasserine Pass and believed American soldiers were soft. They examined their own technical achievements and assumed that German martial tradition would triumph over American adaptability. They looked at American forces and saw what they expected to see. What they did not see was the institutional learning that had transformed green recruits into veterans. They did not see the tactical flexibility that allowed American units to adapt to changing circumstances. They did not see the quality of leadership at every level, from division commander to individual tank crew. This is perhaps the most important lesson of Arracourt. Nations that underestimate adversaries based on preconceptions rather than evidence risk catastrophic misjudgment. The German commanders who sent inexperienced crews in magnificent tanks against battle hardened Americans believed their own mythology rather than examining reality. They paid for that belief with the destruction of their forces. The fields around Arracourt are quiet now. The villages that witnessed some of the most intense armoured combat of the Second World War have returned to the rhythms of rural French life. Farmers work ground that was once churned by tank treads and cratered by shells. The ridgelines where American tankers waited in ambush grow crops tended by people who may not know what happened there 8 decades ago. But the story matters because the patterns it reveals continue to appear. Leaders still confuse assumptions with reality. Nations still underestimate adversaries based on prejudice rather than careful analysis. Military planners still believe that superior technology alone guarantees victory. The cost of such misjudgment remains as high as ever. The men who fought at Arracourt understood something that German planners did not. Victory belongs not to those with the best equipment, but to those who best employ what they have. It belongs to soldiers who train relentlessly, who adapt to circumstances, who maintain their fighting spirit when events turn against them. It belongs to organizations that learn from failure and improve continuously. It belongs to leaders who share the dangers faced by their troops and inspire them through example rather than exhortation. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one deserves to be remembered. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe, united by a shared interest in understanding how the past shapes our present. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.